Honoré de Balzac, Sarrasine. I was deep in one of those daydreams which overtake even the shallowest of men in the midst of the most tumultuous parties. Midnight had just sounded from the clock of the Elysée Bourbon. Seated in a window recess and hidden behind the sinuous folds of a silk curtain, I could contemplate at my leisure the garden of the mansion where I was spending the evening. The trees, partially covered with snow, stood out dimly against the grayish background of a cloudy sky, barely whitened by the moon. Seen amid these fantastic surroundings, they vaguely resembled ghosts, half out of their shrouds, a gigantic representation of the famous Dance of the Dead. Then, turning in the other direction, I could admire the Dance of the Living, a splendid salon decorated in silver and gold with glittering chandeliers, sparkling with candles. There, milling about, whirling around, flitting here and there, were the most beautiful women of Paris, the richest, the noblest, dazzling, stately, resplendent with diamonds, flowers in their hair, on their bosoms, on their heads, strewn over dresses or in garlands at their feet. Light, rustling movements, voluptuous steps made the laces, the silk brocades, the gauzes float around their delicate forms. Here and there, some overly animated glances darted forth, eclipsing the lights, the fire of the diamonds, and stimulated anew some too ardent hearts. One might also catch movements of the head meaningful to lovers, and negative gestures for husbands. The sudden outbursts of the gamblers' voices at each unexpected turn of the dice, the clink of gold mingled with the music and the murmur of conversation, and to complete the giddiness of this mass of people intoxicated by everything seductive the world can hold, a haze of perfume and general inebriation played upon the fevered mind. Thus, on my right, the dark and silent image of death; on my left, the seemly bacchanalias of life. Here cold nature dull in mourning, there human beings enjoying themselves. On the borderline between these two so different scenes, which, 1,000 times repeated in various guises, make Paris the world's most amusing and most philosophical city, I was making for myself a moral Macedon, half pleasant, half funeral. With my left foot I beat time, and I felt as though the other were in the grave. My left was, in fact, chilled by one of those insidious draughts which freeze half our bodies, while the other half feels the humid heat of rooms, an occurrence rather frequent at balls. Monsieur de Lanty hasn't owned this house for very long, has he? Oh, yes. Marechal Carigliano sold it to him nearly 10 years ago. Ah, these people must have a huge fortune. They must have. What a party. It's shockingly elegant. Do you think they're as rich as M. de Nucingen or M. de Gondreville? You mean you don't know? I stuck my head out and recognized the two speakers as members of that strange race which, in Paris, deal exclusively with whys and hows, with where did they come from? What's happening? What has she done? They lowered their voices and walked off to talk in greater comfort on some isolated sofa. Never had a richer vein been offered to seekers after mystery. Nobody knew what country the Lanty family came from, or from what business, what plunder, what piratical activity, or what inheritance derived a fortune estimated at several millions. All the members of the family spoke Italian, French, Spanish, English, and German perfectly enough to create the belief that they must have spent a long time among these various peoples. Were they gypsies? Were they freebooters? Even if it's the devil, some young politician said, they give a marvelous party. Even if the Count de Lanty had robbed a bank, I'd marry his daughter any time, cried a philosopher. Who wouldn't have married Maria Nina, a girl of 16 whose beauty embodied the fabled imaginings of the Eastern poets? Like the Sultan's daughter in the story of the magic lamp, she should have been kept veiled. Her singing put into the shade the partial talents of Malibran, Sontag, and Fodor, in whom one dominant quality has always excluded over all perfection, whereas Maria Nina was able to bring to the same level purity of sound, sensibility, rightness of movement and pitch, soul and science, correctness and feeling. This girl was the embodiment of that secret poetry, the common bond among all the arts, which always eludes those who search for it. Sweet and modest, educated and witty, no one could eclipse Maria Nina save her mother. Have you encountered one of those women whose striking beauty defies the inroads of age, and who seem at 36 more desirable than they could have been 15 years earlier? Their visage is a vibrant soul. It glows. Each feature sparkles with intelligence. Each pore has a special brilliance, especially in artificial light. Their seductive eyes refuse, attract, speak, or remain silent. Their walk is innocently knowledgeable. Their voices employ the melodious wealth of the most coquettishly soft and tender notes. Based on comparisons, their praises flatter the self-love of the most sentient. A movement of their eyebrows, the least glance, their pursed lips, fill with a kind of terror those whose life and happiness depend upon them. Inexperienced in love and influenced by words, a young girl can be seduced. For this kind of woman, however, a man must know, like M.D. Jacquard, not to cry out when he is hiding in a closet and the maid breaks 2 of his fingers as she shuts the door on them. In loving these powerful sirens, one gambles with one's life, and this perhaps is why we love them so passionately. Such was the Countess de Lanty. Filippio, Mary Nina's brother, shared with his sister in the Countess's marvelous beauty. To be brief, this young man was a living image of Antinius, even more slender. Yet how well these thin, delicate proportions are suited to young people when an olive complexion, strongly defined eyebrows, and the fire of velvet eyes give promise of future male passion, of brave thoughts. If Filippo resided in every girl's heart as an ideal, he also resided in the memory of every mother as the best catch in France. The beauty, the fortune, the wit, the charms of these 2 children came solely from their mother. The Count de Lanty was small, ugly, and pockmarked, dark as a Spaniard, dull as a banker. However, he was taken to be a deep politician, perhaps because he rarely laughed and was always quoting Metternich or Wellington. This mysterious family had all the appeal of one of Lord Byron's poems, whose difficulties each person in the fashionable world interpreted in a different way, an obscure and sublime song in every strophe. The reserve maintained by M. and Madame de Lanty about their origin, their past life, and their relationship with the 4 corners of the globe had not lasted long as a subject of astonishment in Paris. Nowhere, perhaps is Vespasian's axiom better understood. There, even blood-stained or filthy money betrays nothing and stands for everything. So long as high society knows the amount of your fortune, you are classed among those having an equal amount, and no one asks to see your family tree, because everyone knows how much it cost. In a city where social problems are solved like algebraic equations, adventurers have every opportunity in their favor. Even supposing this family were of gypsy origin, it was so wealthy, so attractive, that society had no trouble in forgiving its little secrets. Unfortunately, however, the mystery of the Lantes presented a continuing source of curiosity, rather like that contained in the novels of Anne Radcliffe. Observers, people who make it a point to know in what shop you buy your candlesticks, or who ask the amount of your rent when they find your apartment attractive, had noticed now and then, in the midst of the Countess's parties, concerts, balls, and routs, the appearance of a strange personage. It was a man. The first time he had appeared in the mansion was during a concert, when he seemed to have been drawn to the salon by Maria Nina's enchanting voice. "All of a sudden, I'm cold," a lady had said, who was standing with a stranger by the door. The stranger, who was standing next to the woman, went away. "That's odd. I'm warm now," she said, after the stranger had gone. "And you'll say I'm mad, but I can't help thinking that my neighbor, the man dressed in black who just left, was the cause of my chill." Before long, the exaggeration, native to those in high society, gave birth to and accumulated the most amusing ideas, the most outrageous expressions, the most ridiculous anecdotes about this mysterious personage. Although not a vampire, a ghoul, or an artificial man, a kind of Faust or Robin Goodfellow, people fond of fantasy said he had something of all these anthropomorphic natures about him. Here and there, one came across some Germans who accepted as fact these clever witticisms of Parisian scandal-mongering. The stranger was merely an old man. Many of the young men who were in the habit of settling the future of Europe every morning in a few elegant phrases would have liked to see in this stranger some great criminal, the possessor of vast wealth. Some storytellers recounted the life of this old man and provided really curious details about the atrocities he had committed while in the service of the Maharaja of Mysore. Some bankers, more positive by nature, invented a fable about money. "Bah," they said, shrugging their shoulders in pity, "this poor man is a petit genois." "Sir, without being indiscreet, could you please tell me what you mean by a petit genois?" "A man, sir, with an enormous lifetime capital, and whose family's income doubtless depends on his good health." I remember having heard at Madame d'Espar's a hypnotist proving on highly suspect historical data that this old man, preserved under glass, was the famous Balsamo known as Cagliostro. According to this contemporary alchemist, the Sicilian adventurer had escaped death and passed his time fabricating gold for his grandchildren. Last, the bailiff of Ferret maintained that he had recognized this odd personage as the Count of Saint-Germain. These stupidities, spoken in witty accents, with the mocking air characteristic of atheistic society in our day, kept alive vague suspicions about the Lanty family. Finally, through a strange combination of circumstances, The members of this family justified everyone's conjectures by behaving somewhat mysteriously towards this old man, whose life was somehow hidden from all investigation. Whenever this person crossed the threshold of the room he was supposed to inhabit in the Lanti mansion, his appearance always created a great sensation among the family. One might have called it an event of great importance. Filippo, Marianina, Madame de Lanti, and an old servant were the only persons privileged to assist the old man in walking, arising, sitting down. Each of them watched over his slightest movement. It seemed that he was an enchanted being upon whom depended the happiness, the life, or the fortune of them all. Was it affection or fear? Those in society were unable to discover any clue to help them solve this problem. Hidden for whole months in the depths of a secret sanctuary, this family genie would suddenly come forth unexpectedly, and would appear in the midst of the salons like those fairies of bygone days who descended from flying dragons to interrupt the rites of which they had not been invited. Only the most avid onlookers were then able to perceive the uneasiness of the heads of the house, who could conceal their feelings with unusual skill. Sometimes, however, while dancing a quadrille, Marianina, naive as she was, would cast a terrified glance at the old man when she spied him among the crowd, or else Filippo would slip quickly through the throng to his side and would stay near him, tender and attentive, as though contact with others or the slightest breath would destroy this strange creature. The Countess would make a point of drawing near without seeming to have any intention of joining them, then assuming a manner and expression of servitude mixed with tenderness, submission, and power, she would say a few words, to which the old man nearly always deferred, and he would disappear, led off, or more precisely, carried off by her. If Madame de Lanty were not present, the Count used 1,000 stratagems to reach his side. However, he seemed to have difficulty making himself heard, and treated him like a spoiled child, whose mother gives in to his whims in order to avoid a scene. Some bolder persons, having thoughtlessly ventured to question the Count de Lanty, this cold, reserved man had appeared never to understand them. And so, after many tries, all futile because of the circumspection of the entire family, everyone stopped trying to fathom such a well-kept secret. Weary of trying, the companionable spies, the idly curious, and the politic all gave up, both bothering about this mystery. However, even now, perhaps in these glittering salons, there were some philosophers who, while eating an ice or a sherbet, or placing their empty punch glass on a side table, were saying to each other, "It wouldn't surprise me to learn that those people are crooks. The old man who hides and only makes his appearance on the first day of spring or winter or at the solstices looks to me like a killer. Or a confidence man. It's almost the same thing. Killing a man's fortune is sometimes worse than killing the man." "Sir, I have bet 20 louis. I should get back 40. "But, sir, there are only 30 on the table." "Ah, well, you see how mixed the crowd is here. It's impossible to play." "True. But it's now nearly 6 months since we've seen the spirit. Do you think he's really alive?" "Ha, at best." These words were spoken near me by people I did not know, as they were moving off, and as I was resuming, in an afterthought, my mixed thoughts of white and black, life and death, my vivid imagination, as well as my eyes, looked back and forth from the party, which had reached the height of its splendor, and the somber scene in the gardens. I do not know how long I meditated on these two faces of the human coin, but all at once I was awakened by the stifled laugh of a young woman. I was stunned by the appearance of the image which arose before me. By one of those tricks of nature, the half mournful thought turning in my mind had emerged, and it had appeared living before me. It had sprung like Minerva from the head of Jove, tall and strong. It was at once 100 years old and 22 years old. It was alive and dead. Escaped from his room like a lunatic from his cell, the little old man had obviously slipped behind a hedge of people who were listening to Marianina's voice finishing the cavatina from Tancredi. He seemed to have come out from underground, impelled by some piece of strange machinery. Motionless and somber, he stood for a moment gazing at the party, the noises of which had perhaps reached his ears. His almost somnambulatory preoccupation was so concentrated on things that he was in the world without seeing it. He had unceremoniously sprung up next to one of the most ravishing women in Paris, a young and elegant dancer, delicately formed, with one of those faces as fresh as that of a child, pink and white, so frail and transparent that a man's glance seems to penetrate it like a ray of sunlight going through ice. They were both there before me, together united, and so close that the stranger brushed against her, her gauzy dress, her garlands of flowers, her softly curled hair, her floating sash. I had brought this young woman to Madame de Lanty's ball. Since this was her first visit to the house, I forgave her stifled laugh, but I quickly gave her a signal which completely silenced her and filled her with awe for her neighbor. She sat down next to me. The old man did not want to leave this lovely creature, to whom he had attached himself with that silent and seemingly baseless stubbornness to which the extremely old are prone, and which makes them appear childish. In order to sit near her, he had to take a folding chair. His slightest movements were full of that cold heaviness, the stupid indecision, characteristic of the gestures of a paralytic. He sat slowly down on his seat, with circumspection, muttering some unintelligible words. His worn-out voice was like the sound made by a stone falling down a well. The young woman held my hand tightly, as if seeking protection, on some precipice, and she shivered when this man at whom she was looking turned upon her two eyes without warmth. Glaucous eyes, which could only be compared to dull mother-of-pearl. "I'm afraid," she said, leaning toward my ear. "You can talk," I answered. "He's very hard of hearing." "Do you know him?" "Yes." Thereupon she gathered up enough courage to look for a moment at this creature for which the human language had no name, a form without substance, a being without life, or a life without action. She was under the spell of that timorous curiosity which leads women to seek out dangerous emotions, to go see chained tigers, to look at boa constrictors, frightening themselves because they are separated from them only by weak fences. Although the little old man's back was stooped like a laborer's, one could easily tell that he must have had at one time a normal shape. His excessive thinness, the delicacy of his limbs, proved that he had always been slender. He was dressed in black silk trousers, which fell about his bony thighs in folds, like an empty sail. An anatomist would have promptly recognized the symptoms of galloping consumption by looking at the skinny legs supporting this strange body. You would have said they were two bones crossed on a tombstone. A feeling of profound horror for mankind gripped the heart when one saw the marks that decrepitude had left on this fragile machine. The stranger was wearing an old-fashioned, gold-embroidered white waistcoat, and his linen was dazzlingly white. A frill of somewhat yellowed lace, rich enough for a queen's envy, fell into ruffles on his breast. On him, however, this lace seemed more like a rag than an ornament. Centered on it was a fabulous diamond which glittered like the sun. This outmoded luxury, this particular and tasteless jewel, made the strange creature's face even more striking. The setting was worthy of the portrait. This dark face was angular and all sunk in. The chin was sunken, the temples were sunken, the eyes were lost in yellowish sockets. The jawbones stood out because of his indescribable thinness, creating cavities in the center of each cheek. These deformations, more or less illuminated by the candles, produced shadows and strange reflections, which succeeded in erasing any human characteristics from his face. And the years had glued the thin yellow skin of his face so closely to his skull that it was covered all over with a multitude of circular wrinkles, like the ripples on a pond into which a child has thrown a pebble, or star-shaped, like a cracked window pane, but everywhere deep and close set as the edges of pages in a closed book. Some old people have presented more hideous portraits. What contributed the most, however, in lending the appearance of an artificial creature to the spectre which had risen up before us was the red and white with which he glistened. The eyebrows of his mask took from the light a luster which revealed that they were painted on. Fortunately, for the eye depressed by the sight of such ruin, his cadaverous skull was covered by a blonde wig, whose innumerable curls were evidence of an extraordinary pretension. For the rest, the feminine coquetry of this phantasmagorical personage was rather strongly emphasized by the gold ornaments hanging from his ears, by the rings whose fine stones glittered on his bony fingers, and a watch chain which shimmered like the brilliance of a choker around a woman's neck. Finally, this sort of Japanese idol had on his bluish lips a fixed and frozen smile, implacable and mocking like a skull. Silent and motionless as a statue, it exuded the musty odor of old clothes, which the heirs of some duchess takes out for inventory. Although the old man turned his eyes toward the crowd, it seemed that the movements of those orbs incapable of sight were accomplished only by means of some imperceptible artifice. And when the eyes came to rest on something, anyone looking at them would have concluded that they had not moved at all. To see, next to this human wreckage, a young woman whose neck, bosom, and arms were bare and white, whose figure was in the full bloom of its beauty, whose hair rose from her alabaster forehead and inspired love, whose eyes did not receive but gave off light, who was soft, fresh, and whose floating curls and sweet breath seemed too heavy, too hard, too powerful for this shadow, for this man of dust. Ah, here were death and life indeed, I thought, in a fantastic arabesque, half-hideous chimera, divinely feminine from the waist up. Yet there are marriages like that often enough in the world, I said to myself. He smells like a graveyard, cried the terrified young woman, pressing against me for protection, and whose uneasy movements told me she was frightened. What a horrible sight, she went on. I can't stay here any longer. If I look at him again, I shall believe that death itself has come looking for me. Is he alive? She reached out to the phenomenon with that boldness women can summon up out of the strength of their desires. But she broke into a cold sweat, for no sooner had she touched the old man than she heard a cry like a rattle. This sharp voice, if voice it was, issued from a nearly dried-up throat. Then the sound was quickly followed by a little convulsive childish cough of a peculiar sonorousness. At this sound, Maria Nina, Filippo, and Madame de Lanty looked in our direction, and their glances were like bolts of lightning. The young woman wished she were at the bottom of the Seine. She took my arm and led me into a side room. Men, women, everyone made way for us. At the end of the public rooms, we came into a small semicircular chamber. My companion threw herself onto a divan, trembling with fright, oblivious to her surroundings. "Madame, you are mad," I said to her. "But," she replied after a moment of silence, during which I gazed at her in admiration, "is it my fault? Why does Madame de Lanty allow ghosts to wander around her house?" "Come," I replied, "you are being ridiculous, taking a little old man for a ghost." "Be still," she said, with that forceful and mocking air all women so easily assume when they want to be in the right. "What a pretty room," she cried, looking around. "Blue satin always makes such wonderful wall hangings. How refreshing it is. Oh, what a beautiful painting," she went on, getting up and going to stand before a painting in a magnificent frame. We stood for a moment in contemplation of this marvel, which seemed to have been painted by some supernatural brush. The picture was of Adonis, lying on a lion's skin. The lamp hanging from the ceiling of the room in an alabaster globe illuminated this canvas with a soft glow which enabled us to make out all the beauties of the painting. "Does such a perfect creature exist?" she asked me, after having, with a soft smile of contentment, examined the exquisite grace of the contours, the pose, the color, the hair, in short, the entire picture. "He is too beautiful for a man," she added, after an examination such as she might have made of some rival. Oh, how jealous I then felt, something in which a poet had vainly tried to make me believe, the jealousy of engravings, of pictures, wherein artists exaggerate human beauty according to the doctrine which leads them to idolize everything. "It's a portrait," I replied, "the product of the talent of Vien. But that great painter never saw the original, and maybe you'd admire it less if you knew that this daub was copied from the statue of a woman." "But who is it?" I hesitated. "I want to know," she added impetuously. "I believe," I replied, "that this Adonis is a relative of Madame de Lanty." I had the pain of seeing her wrapped in the contemplation of this figure. She sat in silence. I sat down next to her and took her hand without her being aware of it. "Forgotten for a painting." At this moment, the light footsteps of a woman in a rustling dress broke the silence. Young Maria Nina came in, and her innocent expression made her even more alluring than did her grace and her lovely dress. She was walking slowly and escorting with maternal care, with filial solicitude, the costumed spectre who had made us flee from the music room, and whom she was leading, watching with what seemed to be concern as he slowly advanced onto his feeble feet. They went together with some difficulty to a door hidden behind a tapestry. There Maria Nina knocked softly. At once, as if by magic, a tall, stern man, a kind of family genie, appeared. Before entrusting the old man to the care of his mysterious guardian, the child respectfully kissed the walking corpse, and her chaste caress was not devoid of that graceful cajolery of which some privileged women possess the secret. "Adieu, adieu," she said, with the prettiest inflection in her youthful voice. She added to the final syllable a marvelously well-executed trill, but in a soft voice, as if to give poetic expression to the emotions in her heart. Suddenly struck by some memory, the old man stood on the threshold of this secret hideaway. Then, through the silence, we heard the heavy sigh that came from his chest. He took the most beautiful of the rings which adorned his skeletal fingers and placed it in Maria Nina's bosom. The young girl broke into laughter, took the ring, and slipped it onto her finger over her glove. Then she walked quickly towards the salon, from which there could be heard the opening measures of a quadrille. She saw us. "Ah, you are here," she said, blushing. After having seemed as if about to question us, she ran to her partner with the careless petulance of youth. "What did that mean?" my young companion asked me. "Is he her husband? I must be dreaming. Where am I?" "You," I replied. "You, madame, superior as you are. You who understand so well the most hidden feelings. You who know how to inspire in a man's heart the most delicate feelings without blight, without blighting it, without breaking it at the outset. You who pity heartache and who combine the wit of a Parisian with a passionate soul worthy of Italy or Spain." She perceived the bitter irony in my speech, then, without seeming to have heard, she interrupted me. "Oh, you fashion me to your own taste. What tyranny! You don't want me for myself." "I want nothing," I cried, taken aback by her severity. "Is it true, at least, that you enjoy hearing stories of those vivid passions that ravishing southern women inspire in our hearts? Yes, so? So I'll call tomorrow around 9 and reveal this mystery to you." "No," she replied. "I want to know now." "You haven't yet given me the right to obey you when you say I want to." "At this moment," she replied with maddening coquetry, "I have the most burning desire to know the secret. Tomorrow I might not even listen to you." I'll stop there.